And just because you don't have access to a studio doesn't mean that you're out of luck. Today we're going to take a look at using things you might have around the house to light small products. For example, here I'm currently being lit by a little 7 by 7 inch LED panel. I have a little desk lamp going in the back here, and just for a product I've got this little Yashica camera. I'll brighten that up, just a little Yashica film camera. And you'll notice that the light has a fairly soft quality to it, and it's also mostly coming from above. The way I've got this light set up right now is it's actually shining onto the ceiling, and then it's reflecting down onto the subject and onto myself over here. The size of the light source defines how hard it's going to be. Like, for example, this panel is about a 7 by 7 inch panel. If I had a smaller light source, say a little flashlight like this, a much smaller light source and therefore much harder shadows. Let's take a look at how it looks on the subject, on the camera there. With the large light source, let me darken this down a little bit. It's a little bright. I'm also on manual. You'll notice that I'm on manual focus. I find that gives me a little bit more control over focusing on the subject. And I'm on manual exposure, because as you're moving the lights around, you'll find things get brighter and darker, and you want to be able to change those settings on the fly. And with this large light source, you can see that the shadows that it casts are very soft. And the reflections on the product, on the camera itself, are fairly large. They're very soft, large reflections in there. Whereas if I switch over to the flashlight, you'll notice that the reflections are much smaller, much more point source. And the shadows that it casts are much harder edged. So the size of your light source has a lot to do with the quality of light that you're going to be getting out of it. Another important aspect of the light you're using is its color. You can have warm toned lights, you can have cool toned lights, and especially in this era of LED lights, a lot of them have variable color temperatures. Like this one that I got here, you can see actually has a soft white, which has a very warm sort of tone. They call it bright white, which would be a whitish sort of balance, and a daylight, which can have a bit of a cool tone to it. And if your light sources match, if you're using multiple lights on your product, you've got light sources that match, like say for example, this LED panel and this light here, you can end up with a very consistent look across your subject. Like for example, here we have a bit of a cool toned light on the side, and if I bring in this flashlight as a fill, those white balances match. We've got a bit of a cool toned fill and a cool toned light on the right. Now this lamp, this LED panel here actually has variable white balances. I can switch on the back to a very warm tone or a very cool tone. What if I did a warm toned light with a cool toned fill? You can get a bit of a bluish reflection on the side. Or if I want to go extra funky, you can change the white balance on your camera. What if I set this white balance from tungsten to a daylight setting? And now we get that very warm toned light coming from the side, and that fill light can have a much cooler bluish sort of tone to it. So I've got some mismatched light sources going in here. And don't forget that if you're shooting in the RAW format, you have the ability to change the white balance after the fact. If you want to make things look a little bit warmer, you can play with that temperature slider. If you want to cool it off a little bit. And if you want to play with the brightness, you've got a little bit of control over the exposure. You can increase or decrease that exposure a little bit, maybe a stop or two after the fact. Now, obviously, if you're too far underexposed, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot about it. So do make sure that you have enough light on the scene that you don't end up with something like this happening. You can see there's a lot of extra noise and color artifacts happening in the shadows there. Now in a studio environment, you'll have access to much larger light sources. This is an example of an image that was taken with a very hard light source. So this was just a simple bare bulb light on a stand. And you can see again, it has those very hard shadows and the reflections. Even though this is a matte surfaced telephone here, they're still fairly small and fairly hard reflections. By using a soft box, which is basically a much larger light source that clips onto the original light, you'll notice that the shadows, first off, get much softer. There's the small light, the hard light source, and there's that large soft light source. The reflections in the ball there, you can see there's that hard pinpoint light of that small light source, and there's that much softer light of the large light source. And even the reflections on the telephone. It's a matte surface, so it has a very dull sort of reflection to it, but that larger light source really smooths that out. And even helps with some of the texture. You can see on the receiver here, There's the small light source. You can see every little scratch, every little piece of dust in there. That larger light source helps soften out that light. When you get this close to a product, the closer you get to something, the shallower the depth of field becomes. So as you get this close, you might be able to use that shallow depth of field to kind of guide your viewer's attention. Like in this image here, the camera is focused on the very front of this telephone, actually just outside the frame there. But if I shift the focus back a little bit, now we're looking at the numbers on the dial, and the receiver and the mannequin head in the background become kind of secondary. If I shift the focus a little further back, now we're taking a look at the mannequin head and the receiver. Those become the obvious focal points of the image. Same deal with this image from the side. Here we're noticing the mannequin head and the telephone becomes secondary. If I shift the focus forward, now we're looking at the telephone and your viewer is less noticing of the subject in the background. So you can kind of guide your viewer's attention around the image by shifting that point of focus. Now the larger your aperture, the better you're going to be able to play with that very shallow depth of field. But if you get back from the subject and zoom in on it, longer focal length lenses also tend to have shallower depth of field. And what about contrast? The contrast of your light, your lighting on your subject can have a big impact on how soft or appealing or how stark and harsh the image looks. We took a look at using a separate light as a fill, a little bit of a flashlight, but what about something as simple as a sheet of paper, just to reflect some light back into the subject? Let's take a quick peek at using just a simple sheet of paper. You'll notice that this is a very hard light. It's very dark on one side, very bright on the other. Take a look what happens if I lower this sheet of paper in. I'm just kind of putting a piece of paper in, and it just reflects some of that light back into the shadows. So you don't necessarily have to have multiple lights. You could have a light on one side and just a simple reflector on the other. And again, this is just a sheet of white paper here. You could use tin foil if you want a little bit more reflection. And if you look around at some of the, Amazon, some of the camera stores, they'll often have colored reflectors as well. Maybe you want to have a cool toned light, but then you want to have a bit of a warmer reflection in there. If you use a gold foil reflector, you can get a bit of a warmer toned reflection into there. Now, what if you don't have access to lots of lights and reflectors and a big fancy studio like I have here? Nobody says you have to photograph a product all at once. In the next lecture, we're going to take a look at photographing something in pieces. Let's say I were to light the back of this stapler and the top of the stapler and the front of the stapler. We'll take a look at using Photoshop to combine those images together into one perfectly lit shot.